So we have the pleasure of being joined by both Lucas Metropolis and Garrett Swam, and I will go ahead and pass it to them to introduce themselves, but should be a lovely session. You all are in for such a treat.
Okay, great. So I'll go first. My name is Lucas Metropolis. I've been a professional fundraising coach with Bonterra for a few years now, specifically on the Network for Good product. I'm also the managing director of Chronos Strategies, and so I've worked with a little over 150 nonprofits really across the US and internationally over the past 8+ years, raising over 200 million for, again, a variety of different causes. Truly organizations that are super, super small or just starting, all the way up to ones that have been established for a while and have very large budgets. I've also started 2 nonprofit organizations, one in South Florida where I'm from, as well as internationally in the Bahamas. And so I say this because I do know in terms of in smaller shops, wearing many hats, and I do know that those experiences in really scaling up fundraising through a variety of different ways. So I'll pass it to Garrett.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lucas. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Excited to be here today. My name is Garrett Swaim, and I've had the pleasure of working with both large and small nonprofits for the last 6 years. In that time, I've worked with 501c3 and C4 organizations. I've worked with independent community and family foundations. So my background is very much so in philanthropic software. Prior to coming to Bonterra, I was at a company called Blackbaud, which some of you might know. But today I get to work with fundraisers and some of Bonterra's highest impact customers. So we're really excited that you all are joining us today and sharing some of the unique insights that we can provide. So with that, let's start with who is Bonterra and what insight can we provide on today's call? So to start, Bonterra is the second largest and fastest growing social good software company in the world. What that means is that we currently serve over 20,000 customers. And of that 20,000 customers, 15,000 plus are nonprofits. So why does that all matter? I would say simply 3 words, or rather 1 word 3 times. Data, data, data. We have lots and lots of data. And being able to see this aggregate data across the giving sector provides us unique insights that we can share with our customers and with you all today. So that's where we want to start, by taking a look at what we observed on Giving Tuesday in 2023, and then zoom out a bit and see how things compare to the rest of end-of-year fundraising, and kind of how all of that plays together with first-time donors, their retention journey, and how to create those long-term relationships that will keep our donors and constituents coming back to support the mission year over year. Does that sound good with everyone? I know everyone's yelling yes in the background. Okay, so let's start here. So on Giving Tuesday in 2023, we observed that 43% of donors were new or first-time donors to an organization. Makes sense comparing to 57% on Giving Tuesday, the specific day, were returning non-first-time donors to the organization. That's great. That data validates our existing hypothesis that Giving Tuesday is a huge opportunity to attract new donors to the organization, but really how much so? These figures are only relevant with a suitable comparable. So in our analysis on the days surrounding Giving Tuesday, and as we define surrounding, we mean the 72 hours prior and the 72 hours following Giving Tuesday, we observed that the number of new gifts from first-time donors or new donors drops to 24%. Comparably, 76% of those gifts in that 6-day period, 72 hours before, 72 hours afterwards, come from returning or existing donors. This is really some great framing for the size of the opportunity that Giving Tuesday in isolation provides to attract new donors who are interested in learning more about our mission, about our work, and to really start building those relationships. But looking at Giving Tuesday individually, how does that really compare and play a part in the rest of year-end giving? Well, I promised we'd zoom out a bit and take a broader look at those things, and that's what we're going to do now. So it's no secret that the later months of the year are very strong for fundraising for a variety of reasons. What's telling is that impressive figure we just saw of 43% of gifts coming from new and first-time donors on Giving Tuesday balloons up to 56% when we analyze the dating from Giving Tuesday through the end of the year. Equally important, in that same cohort, 31% made at least 1 repeat gift to the org. So this is really great to know as we kind of think through donor acquisition costs, and it continues to validate that year-end is an incredibly valuable time to attract gifts and new donors. Now, you might be saying, Garrett, tell me something I don't know. I understand, and the figures are helpful, that Giving Tuesday and year-end fundraising are important for our orgs, but so what? What was most potent to me about the data that we analyzed, when we looked at it historically, we found that new donor acquisitions in the months of November and December had a 53% higher retention rate compared to new donor acquisitions between January and October. I'll say that again because I want it to resonate. 53% higher retention rate for new donor acquisitions in November and December compared to January and October. So the data is really telling us a story. And that story is that we're quickly approaching the highest value time of the year for new donor acquisition, donors who have the potential to give multiple times in 2025, and to start building out multi-year relationships with individuals who are looking for meaningful new work to support. But in order to start building those relationships, we first need to understand things like how the individuals found us in the first place, what compelled them to give, and how do we effectively communicate with them to continue to earn that support year over year. And for that, I'm going to pass the ball to Lucas. But before I do, I'm going to share a fun bonus insight, because I always think data is incredible because you never know what it's going to provide. So bonus insight: donors who give on December 31st, on average, have a 15% higher lifetime value. And I think we could do a whole nother webinar and speculate and kind of theorize about why that is, but something I just wanted to share with the group. So with that, Lucas, I will pass the ball to you.
Okay, great. So as Garrett said, we're really talking about Giving Tuesday coming up December 3rd. But really, what happens after that. But before we start talking about that, we have to understand, how are you finding these first-time donors, or how are they finding you? And so some of the origins, these are pretty typical. But in terms of, as you approach Giving Tuesday, it is important for you to think about what are those channels you'll be opening up to allow these folks to come to you and start supporting. And one of them, obviously, is a peer-to-peer fundraising supporters. You hear a lot about peer-to-peer campaigns. Giving Tuesday, that's really, a large part of what it is meant to be, is that idea of peers stepping forward and motivating their friends, family to support you all. And so with that, I also would advocate for you to really think through trying to find a diverse group of peers to step forward. I've done many, many fundraising campaigns where a charity will just pressure their board and say, hey, you're going to do this for Giving Tuesday. You're going to get us people. And oftentimes the board members know the same people. And so when they think about getting these first-time donors, it tends to be the same folks repeating, which is wonderful, but it doesn't really open the door to new avenues for new relationships to form. Special events, obviously there's a wide variation of types of special events. A really common one, if you haven't done anything yet, I like to do these smaller targeted events around year end, maybe even around Giving Tuesday, finding a peer or a board member or donor that might be willing to open up their networks and invite folks in to support. It's a great way to get these first-time donors in the door. Volunteer conversions, that is an area that I work with a lot of nonprofits who don't really spend much time on involving their volunteers in the actual fundraising process, or encouraging them to also give, especially around a day like Giving Tuesday. And what I mean by that is really looking at your rosters of volunteers, if you have them, and putting out messaging, inviting them to participate, treating them like your overall donors, but making perhaps a little bit more of a personal experience for them, recognizing that they've also, gone above and beyond, usually volunteering their time beyond just resources. The other piece to think about is social media. So with social media, one platform that I use a lot these days that a lot of charities still are not using is LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great resource. If you don't have a nonprofit company page, I would encourage you to create one and try to invite all your connections and have others invite their connections to follow you. And I'll skip ahead because I also would say with targeted ads, I have a lot of nonprofits that ask me, how much should we be spending? Is it a waste of time? And I always say, around giving days like Giving Tuesday, it's really to help market and broadcast your message. Do I expect when a nonprofit puts $100 behind a boosted post on Giving Tuesday that they're going to drive thousands of dollars out of nowhere? Not usually, but it is keeping that emphasis on supporting your nonprofit front and center for many of donors. And the other one I didn't mention was local media. And so around Giving Tuesday, there is a lot of communications that are coming out, a lot for everyone to find new donors and bring back people that have supported before. So definitely being out there with your story. And even now in the weeks and month and a half we have rolling into it, trying to get some more awareness, trying to promote and get more posts out there, making sure people realize all the great work you guys have done over the past year, and just keeping that engagement out there. All right, keep going. All right, so now beginning that journey. So once someone has actually come forward and made a donation, a big thing is the timeliness at which you start recognizing them. So I always say to nonprofits that when a donor gives, it's a vote of confidence. And I also say, Giving Tuesday is a little later this year. It's December 3rd. So with that, why is someone giving you a gift in December? Oftentimes it is a vote of confidence in your nonprofit. They say, what have you done? You've now shared all the great impact you've done throughout the year. You know what? I believe in you. Here's you expect that you're going to use that money in the month of December. It's really a vote of confidence going into 2025. And so with that, the timeliness, when someone makes a donation, there's a lot of stats out there, and I'll mention a few in terms of what does that do to actually increase retention, depending on how quickly you thank people. And so a quick stat I always like to say is that within 48 hours after someone gives, your chances of getting a second gift goes up by 400% if you thank within that 48-hour window. The other piece you hear a lot, I mean, there's so many stats out there, but 91% of people say that they're more likely to support a cause if the thank you is more personalized. And so that's why I say that when someone gives that gift, sometimes I actually make a spreadsheet and I even just track the new donors that came off the giving day. And some of them I'll put on different journeys. Sometimes I might stratify it based on their gift level of what they gave. Sometimes I might stratify as, okay, these are new donors. Perhaps they're in different friend groups. Perhaps we added a custom field to the donation page that noted, who motivated them to give. Was it a board member? I worked with one nonprofit where they had a custom field actually, or in the in honor part, where they actually allowed someone to select, who motivated you to give this, because it was a board driven push. And so people started selecting the board members. And that was actually great in terms of trying to retain them, because then we were able to work with the donors that had recommended them to give and the board members as we approached the next round of asking for the next calendar year. We were able to approach them and say, hey, these were the 8 people that gave in your honor last year. Can you help us perhaps have a conversation with them earlier now, prior to Giving Tuesday happening again, so we can maybe get them to give more, or at least get them to retain and give again. So with that, also understanding your communication channels and preferences. So sometimes, like for example, Network for Good, I have a custom field, I call it communication preferences. And I will generally put, folks like do not mail, do not solicit, do not email, do not call. And sometimes I like to look at that going into some of these give days and recognizing early on how people want to be communicated with. I've worked with a lot of nonprofits where we approach these give days and we look and we say, well, that person unsubscribed from our email. They clearly hate us. And oftentimes we then call that same donor and the donor's like, yeah, I haven't heard from you guys in a while. And they don't even realize they've unsubscribed, or they've unsubscribed just because they get a lot of messages. It doesn't mean that they don't like the nonprofit. So I would say that as you get a clean slate, right? Once someone gives for the first time, you thank them in a timely manner. You now have a chance to understand that relationship. And it's also part of it is to understand how do they want to be engaged? What are those channels to reach them on? And it might not be traditional ones. I've had donors that I've reached out to that tell me I do nothing but message through LinkedIn. So if you want to reach me, if you want to tell me impact, send me a direct message. I've had some weird ones too, but that was definitely one. And then in terms of some acknowledgement, one interesting thing that I've done actually for a few different nonprofits now, I call it Release the Swag. And there's some platforms out there. I don't really need to name specific ones, but if you look it up in terms of, there's some companies out there that will allow you to kind of make this branded swag that's kind of on demand. And I've worked with nonprofits for very, very low budgets where we've taken, let's say, donors that gave us $250 or more, or $100 or more, and we set a budget of $20 per donor. And sometimes after we get a first-time donor, we'll send them a link to get their swag. And I love it because the charity's not holding any inventory, but the donor gets it. And there's some platforms that make it a really cool experience. And I've actually seen a lot of engagement and a lot of folks feeling very stewarded, and they're walking around town wearing that. And so thinking through different ways, I've worked with nonprofits who go a little over the top when they think about stewarding their donors with gifts. That's another conversation, but definitely making sure that these ways that we recognize donors are meaningful and are in line with your mission, what you're doing. And then, like I said early on, really setting these donors on a journey. They give for the first time. They get their thank you within 48 hours. That might be via email. Does a board member do a phone call? Does the executive director try to set up a meeting? Kind of what is that process when they make a gift? It shouldn't be someone gives a gift December 3rd this year, and then in November, December of next year, we all of a sudden pick up the phone and we call that person asking them for support. Your chance of retention is really low. All right, we can keep going. All right, so I've already mentioned a few points here, but in terms of kind of some of the post-donation fees, one thing I've done is, I skip ahead to introduce the other leaders. I did an exercise this summer with a nonprofit where the board and the development committee, I said, their fiscal year ended June 30. And I said, hey, these are all the donors from this fiscal year. Do we know everybody? And different people knew different people. I said, okay, we're all going to take people we don't know above a certain threshold. And so a lot of board members freaked out because they didn't want to call people they did not know. They wanted to call the ones they had motivated. But I said, I don't want the relationship with this donor just to be to one leader of the charity. That's much more risky. And so I had a lot of them. And it was funny, at first, everyone was very apprehensive, but I had a case where one person called the donor who had given us about $25,000. He made the phone call, and 2 months later, that same donor doubled down and sent another 25,000 right off the bat, and noted that it was because of that wonderful call that they had received from a board member. They had never had communication with that person before. So I will say sometimes varying the point of contact at your nonprofit can be very helpful when we think about recognizing people and also about a follow-up. And then, for example, if you have events, all of a sudden now they're not coming only recognizing one leader, but they recognize multiple members of your board, executive director. It just creates a better relationship with a nonprofit. I'm also trying to shorten that time to the second gift. So a lot of times, for example, we have Giving Tuesday this year, December 3. Do we have to wait now to the fall of 2025 to actually solicit that donor? Again, you don't. And a lot of times with nonprofits, I'll do kind of a spring campaign. And usually, sometimes it's not always based on raising the amount of cash. Sometimes it's based on participation. And why I do it, especially for donors that give a bit less than the average, I like to encourage that they might give more than once in a given calendar year, and many do. And so you should really be trying to think of ways to shorten the time from which they give their next donation. Obviously, of course, you can think through maybe recurring donations. One thing I do a lot is the third, fourth week of January is a time I love to push for recurring gifts, because a lot of donors will treat it more like a subscription, right? They have 12 months in their eyes to make that gift. And so sometimes I'll do that. My end of the year donors, end of the calendar year donors, I'll try to actually move some of them, especially ones that I see that give a bit below the average, to consider doing that recurring monthly contribution, even late January and February, March, to kick that off. The other piece, when we think about the long-term strategies, it's not just, calling someone up and say, hey, how are you doing? It's also your chance now to start really showcasing that impact. And so when I say showcasing that impact, it's, what are you doing throughout the year? You asked this donor for a gift at the end of the calendar year, or someone asked them to support you. Now you have the time to show them all that wonderful work that you're doing throughout the year. And so for me, it's always these two peak times of giving. It's really, for me, it's usually March to June, and then November and December. October's in that as well. But those kind of troughs between, a lot of folks will just wait. I like to use those periods. So like January to March is a really prime time to really showcase your impact. Sometimes I like to do donor spotlights. And what those are is just really trying to find different types of supporters. They don't always have to be the biggest, but different stories to tell, so that your audience, especially the new people who've now joined your family of donors, can actually see other folks perhaps like themselves. And they say, I have the same feeling. That's why I give too. And you start feeling this feeling of community around supporting a nonprofit, where it takes away the idea that maybe a peer pressured someone to give $25 on a giving day because they said, hey, this is a great set. But it starts making them have some ownership of the community and some standing in the community, and want to continue to be part of it and form a relationship, and not just be a relationship based on a transaction once a year. All right, we can keep going. All right. So I talked about already a little bit on trying to get some frequency with giving. It's obviously a really important point. if you can increase the frequency at which folks give the gifts. Sometimes folks will give different types of gifts as well. You might bring donors in for the first time because of Giving Tuesday, but fast forward, even depending on the economy, someone might volunteer in the spring and say, hey, I actually have some appreciated stock that I'd like to give. Is there a way to do that with you all? So kind of keeping those lines of communications open will always be helpful. Another thing I've done a lot is kind of thinking through a welcome series. And so these are, there's ways to certainly queue those up as templates, and start thinking through what is that content? What is that journey we want to take the donor on early on? So you've sent the thank you. When I'm saying welcome series, I'm really thinking through, okay, can a next email be, hey, we have these 2 events coming up in the spring. By the way, we actually have volunteer opportunities. We'd love for you to volunteer. Depending on your cause, you might have very interesting experiences that they can be part of. Or you might have very interesting impact to quickly share with people. But thinking through, 2 to 3 kind of welcome messages that really start showing people the whole picture. Because again, you don't know necessarily how much information they truly have about who you all are. Do they really understand what you're doing? I've solicited donations from donors who've been giving for 10 years. And when I talk to them, they knew like 10% of what the nonprofit actually does. And then also, really thinking through, like I said before, those slow times in the giving year, making sure that you're capitalizing on that period. Another big slow time is the summer, usually, depending on where you are in seasonality. But for a lot of nonprofits, it's those summer months in the US. And, that's a peak time that I actually like to reach out to folks that have given before, as well as the ones who were kind of queuing up for the calendar year end. And many of them will blow me off and say, hey, I'm too busy, I'm traveling, I can't meet right now. But all of a sudden now I have an email thread of all these folks who said, yeah, I'll meet with you early fall. And when we get to the early fall, we're able to quickly have some of these quick conversations, and you're now setting yourself up for an even better next Giving Tuesday, next end of the calendar year campaign. And so those are just a few little things I like to do.
Perfect. Thanks, Lucas.
Yeah.
I'll jump back in to talk about maximizing our outcomes with efficient systems. So as I mentioned kind of in my introduction, I've had the pleasure of working with a number of nonprofits over the last 6 years and some of Bonterra's highest impact customers now. And the common theme that I gather from all of these customers, especially those with individual giving programs or sustainer programs, is the value of having unified data, right? They recognize that we are in this relationship business, right? We are trying to build these long-term relationships to not solicit one gift, but year over year support of the organization. So we do not understate the value of having all of that donor data in one place to create that 360-degree view of who your donor is, what they care about, what are those important channels to them, like Luke was talking about, and how do they want to engage, right? Having this unified space, and whether you're a Bonterra customer or not, having a unified space leads us to that thoughtful outreach, that time, that channel, that message, which leads to higher retention, increases lifetime value, potential upgrades, and then ultimately more revenue for your organization, greater impact on the mission, more operational budget, so on and so forth. So we firmly believe here at Bonterra that unified data is the driver of relationships, which ultimately drives success for nonprofits. Lucas, I'll kick it back over to you for these key takeaways.
Okay, great. And as Garrett said, looking at, it's quite a stat, a 53% higher retention rate for donors that were acquired in the November, December time. So we're not there yet. You have some time to really set the strategy in place and make sure, like we said early on, you have all of those channels coming to you, all that the funnels to get some of these first-time donors. And as I noted, looking at the timely acknowledgements, I cannot stress that enough. I had plenty phone calls with donors of different nonprofits that felt like the charity waited too long. You can never thank too much. Sometimes even with a lot of the online donation platforms, you get that quick receipt, and a lot of people treat that quick receipt as the acknowledgement. I always like, if it's an online gift, for example, I always want them to get the receipt, of course, so they know the transaction went through, but I always will send an extra acknowledgement that really is usually from an executive director or someone who's a leader in the charity, and really stressing that impact and telling something a little more meaningful than saying your transaction was processed, tax deductible up to the full extent of the law, like a little more meat to it. And then also really diversifying your outreach. So think through, when I think about even your year-end campaigns, those different channels from mail to email, text messaging, social media, think through all those channels. Are you using them? Or are you maybe missing out on some new first-time donors that you can put through this retention process we're talking about? And then also, of course, your data. Really spend a little time here, gearing up for the calendar year-end campaign period. Spend some time looking at your data, finding the holes, looking again. It comes back to the diversified outreach. Do you have the ways to actually reach some of these folks through these channels directly, not just in a mass way? And so really looking at your data is a really important step for here at year end. All right.
With that, we'd love to open up the floor for questions and kick it back to you, Ashley.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for such insightful information. I feel prepared for Giving Tuesday, and I'm not a nonprofit, but I love that idea, Lucas, of doing the swag for donors. I've never heard of that. I think that's really interesting. And the welcome email series, that's something I have not yet heard of. So thank you both for such insight. Folks on the call here, if you are interested in kind of learning more about specifically some of our tools and services and how they might help you all get better prepared for Giving Tuesday, not only for Giving Tuesday, but really the work that needs to do after Giving Tuesday. I'm going to launch another quick poll here. Again, please feel free to fill that out, and we'll have one of our colleagues reach out to you after today's session. But we do have a couple of questions here in the chat and Q&A that I'll pose to both of you. Whoever wants to respond, please feel free to. The first one being from Lisa. I guess this will be more so for you, Lucas. If you could talk more about some of the stories that you have with like over-the-top stewardship and kind of what you've seen in your work.
Yeah, I read that one. I kind of laughed. I knew it was coming. What I mean by that is also comes budgetarily. So like I had an experience of a major gift donor who gave a significant amount of money, and they sent him a very nice pen that was worth hundreds of dollars, and as a thank you, and it was monogrammed and everything. And that donor reacted very negatively. And it might seem like a simple thing, like why would you do that? But to them, they saw it as a very nice stewardship tactic, and that donor took it very angrily and did not really, it called his support into question in terms of how they're using the resources. So what I mean by this is thinking through, what are those lower budget items? And that's why I like the swag, because it's as long as it's really moderate, like, a hat with a logo on it. I always find donors love things like that. I've seen other things like trying to just be a little over top with some of the experiences too. Like I've had donors, that even smaller donors, that the nonprofit just heavily pushes them to come to different activities to the point where it's an annoyance. And so just being moderate with, when I think again about that donor journey, making sure you're also being respectful of that person. You're also thinking through how they might perceive the outreach or how you choose to recognize them. Yeah, the pen was an interesting case though.
That is interesting. I would love an expensive pen, so I would take that happily. Awesome. We have another question that came in. Paul asked if you have any specific suggestions for nonprofits that maybe like help veterans, if you have any expertise on that, if you've worked with veteran-focused nonprofits.
Yeah, I have. I mean, that question related to retention, I think comes back again. Like I always try to think of what is the motivation for those donors to join you for the first time. I always get asked these questions for me to say, can you connect us to wealthy people in our town that would give to our charity? And I always say it's much harder to find the people with the affinity than it is to find people of wealth. There is plenty of wealth. There is plenty of capacity out there. It's finding the people that have the affinity to give to a cause like yours. So for a veterans cause, thinking through, who might some of those pockets of people be, and how are we putting our messaging that would be appealing to them? So you really want to think through, like, who are those personas of folks in your audience or in your community, or the ones that you're trying to attract, and really build not just your outreach and your appeals around that, but also your stewardship. So when they give their first gift on Giving Tuesday, what is that journey? Is it someone whose a grandfather fought in World War II? And, maybe you want to showcase some stories of some, interviewing perhaps that family about stories of their grandfather and the impact he had on their lives. And so again, really thinking through that, the messaging, I'd say, would be big for causes like a veteran nonprofit.
Awesome. We also had another question come in, and this might be applicable for both of you to answer, but if you could talk about, I guess, how many times a year nonprofits should send out ask other than Giving Tuesday and like year of end giving, like what is kind of best practice with that? What have you seen with some of the organizations that you both have worked with?
Derek, should I take it or you want to take it?
No, I'll defer to you, Lucas, since this is your
Okay,
realm.
sure. So you said the frequency of asking? That was the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I always say it's there's two peak times where I do kind of a public facing campaign. Now, of course, if you have maybe your own giving day, you might do a little push around that. Every nonprofit, school, etc., I find has their own certain period of time they'd also like to ask that might be irregular from the norm. But I do say, like, I usually do at least two public facing campaigns where I always put a goal amount out there. I always have a finite period of time at which I'm fundraising, but I might do projects throughout the year that might be very targeted to specific groups. For example, maybe you host an event that's a community run, and that's a little fundraiser for you. Well, of course, you might put some messaging and some appeals around that event. So again, just mapping it all out. You don't want to get to the point where every month you're asking the same people. It's also looking again back at your audience to say, like, if you only have 100 or 300 emails in your system, sending them an email every month to ask for a gift, not really the best strategy, but maybe trying to compartmentalize that to say, you know what, we have this group came from, from this event that we have it every year. How can we grow that bigger? But seeing how it all fits into, not at the point of overwhelming people. But I will say, I have had examples where nonprofits kept people out too much. They segmented way too much. And so there were donors that came to an event like the run that would have given for some kind of little fundraiser that happened months later, but they never received that communication. And so I will say, just being careful with, yes, you want to know kind of the source at which you're getting these folks and maybe their interest, but you also don't want to automatically exclude them from any kind of wider ask that you need to make for the charity.
Very good point. Very good point, Lucas. If you don't mind kind of touching on and addressing how to use social media as a nonprofit and maybe some tips you have with social media. I know that I've seen it a lot. Nonprofits can definitely struggle with that, learning social media, let alone gaining traction on there. So yeah, if you don't mind kind of talking about that.
Sure. I mean, I usually like to use a tool. Like if you're a smaller shop or marketing folks or comms folks, for social media, I usually use some social media sharing product like Hootsuite or Buffer. Buffer is pretty much cheaper, but I use that one a lot. That allows me to cross post across our key platforms. I usually try to, at least for a nonprofit, have Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X. Those are kind of the big four. Of course, there's TikTok, and some have really built that up for their audience, but those four I find to be great. For me, a lot of, again, I could go back to LinkedIn. LinkedIn has been very successful for me in directly asking for donations. Instagram for me has become, with a lot of nonprofits I work with, has become a great awareness tool. If you think about the structure even of a post, it's very much picture heavy, right? It's all in that picture. And so, yeah, I found using those kind of cross-promoting tools have been very helpful for smaller staffs. Also kind of scheduling it out. So when I talk about year end, like if I send an appeal for our calendar year end push here, I'm going to also do a social post across those platforms. So I'm just taking some of that language. Now, a lot of folks will lead up to, let's say, Giving Tuesday with series talking about the impact. I don't always find that a lot of direct conversions happen from like a post on Facebook or Instagram, but I do find that it's often the same audience and they're engaging with your content on a different channel and seeing some elements of your impact. I did a study the other day of one of my clients where I basically exported all their followers on Instagram and I cross-referenced that with their annual report to see what is the commonality. Are folks that are donating to us actually looking at our Instagram? And I found it was like 60 to 70% for that nonprofit were actually viewing posts pretty frequently. And so in my mind, then it validated our efforts on social media because there was comments of, is this generating revenue? And for me, it's generating awareness and it's keeping people. That's a great value, especially when you're out against a ton of different appeals from nonprofits.
Yeah, and I would add there too, I saw another question in the chat pop up about leveraging social media influencers to drive donations. And this is timely. Ashley recently mentioned that Donor Drive recently joined the Bonterra family, and they have got have had a lot of success with their Twitch integration. Not too long ago, they had an organization that partnered with a popular Twitch gamer. That's the streaming service, gaming streaming service for everyone who isn't familiar with it, and in less than 24 hours raised over $1 million. So we're certainly seeing these channels starting to be leveraged, and then organizations actively reaching out to try and build relationships with social media influencers like they do their new donors, right? And they're following a similar pattern. They're trying to find individuals that have, a tie-in or resonate with their mission work. But it's never too early to start building those relationships, and we're starting to see that channel really emerge.
Interesting. I have not yet heard of Twitch and raising money, but that's interesting. That's interesting. A very new platform to me and a new avenue, which definitely sounds interesting. Awesome. We have a couple of questions. They've come in through the chat. They're coming through the Q&A. They're flowing. They're flowing. We have a question from Ray who asked, and I think this can kind of apply to everyone on the call here. Essentially, just kind of making their organization stand out with Giving Tuesday. Of course, there's a lot of noise with Giving Tuesday. Multiple nonprofits are coming at people. So just any insight that you all can share on kind of standing out and making your nonprofit louder than maybe some of the others.
Yeah, I would say don't wait. That's, it's funny. I had one client who once accidentally sent an email that had one sentence in it. And they sent it out, and it was one of their best performing emails. And so I'll say timing is important. Content is important. Sharing the impact of your story is very important. But I will say don't miss out on timing, and don't miss out now. You have some time before Giving Tuesday. So don't miss out on using this time to go ahead and for example, if you had supporters from last year, go ahead, talk to them now. Go ahead and message them, see how they're doing, let them know an update, some touch point to where they're more primed up for Giving Tuesday. And then also use this time now, even for first-time donors. You don't have to wait till that day for someone to stumble across a Instagram post and make a donation. You could start thinking through those pockets of new potential donors now and perhaps get in the door. Maybe it's your local Rotary, and all of a sudden you're like, you know what, we know two of the members, we've never really tried to get that group perhaps behind us. Maybe talk to those two folks and see if they might have some other peers in their local Rotary club that they on Giving Tuesday can promote to, or that they can introduce you to now. So I will say standing out, there's definitely things you could do in terms of telling your impact. But I find one of the biggest ways that clients I work with stand out is by utilizing as much time as they can to put donors in this journey and to map out these new buckets of prospects that they might be able to queue up beforehand and during a Giving Tuesday.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little piece there. When I talk to customers about this, right, waiting until Giving Tuesday to start reaching out is too late, right? And I equate it to, when my friends only reach out to me when they need something from me, that doesn't feel very friendly, right? But when I have friends who I keep in touch with, we talk regularly, we let each other know how our lives are going, right? And then they need something, I'm much more happy to facilitate that ask, right? So I like that analogy because I think it resonates with our donors as well.
Definitely. Good point, Garrett.
Actually, real quick, I'll mention, I just put in the chat the link to the one I was talking about. I don't get any kind of fee or anything from it. I want to disclaim that. But I just posted, it's called Snappy. It's a tool that I've used that a lot for the swag. People were asking if there's a good link for that. So it's
perfect.
It's cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for plugging that into the chat. Awesome. Again, I'm just making sure that we are going through as many questions as we can here. Let's see. Yeah, looks like, oh, we just had one last question come through. I guess identifying new donors and what that kind of looks like. I know that there are obviously tools out there that can help identify new donors, but yeah, if you could talk about what that looks like and how to segment them.
Yeah, so there's a lot of tools out there that you have to pay for, right? I mean, I have a lot, through my work, I have a lot of access to different wealth analytic tools and prospect identification tools. But I will say In terms of free, I first always think through, you want to think through, again, what are your networks? Immediately, the easiest thing to do is think about your connections, possibly your board's connections, volunteer connections, staff connections, your internal donor base. Have you ever asked any folks to actually recommend another person? Like that is by far one of the highest value of identifying some new prospects with affinity. Now, if you're talking about, well, we want folks with higher capacity and potential affinity, that is where some of those donor tools come in handy. But you can also start thinking through, again, going the affinity route. A common thing every nonprofit does is often look at any nonprofits that might be similar in perhaps geography or causal area, looking at annual reports of those nonprofits to say, who are the big players in town? Do we have any way to get access to them as well? That's probably one of the most commonly, quietly used thing that every nonprofit does. But yeah, and like I said, there's other tools. If you want to think more, like come back to LinkedIn, certainly if you're like, what, based on certain roles, I can determine that they might have more capacity to support us. You can certainly use filters in LinkedIn to find different prospects. One tool I use a lot in LinkedIn, even if you search people, you can actually select if someone's looking to volunteer for a nonprofit or join a board. You can actually, so for example, if you selected, let's do Charleston, South Carolina, and I want folks who actively want to volunteer for a nonprofit, you can select those two, and you might get, oh, wow, there's 80 people here. Let me go through these individuals, and you can message them. You might be able to see who you're connected to that knows them, and that can be your introduction. So I use that a lot for new prospects with not needing to really spend any money.
Awesome. I did not know that LinkedIn had that tool. Very interesting. Is that a new feature, Lucas? Or is
No,
that's been good?
it's been there for a while, and I don't think I have premium, but I don't think it's a premium thing. I don't think it is. But
Okay,
check it out.
interesting.
Check it out. If you don't have it, then it is a premium thing. But it's worth
No,
it.
I will be accessing that after we wrap up today. I've never heard of that. Awesome. And I think we have time for maybe one or two more additional questions here. But a question that we have is, in your experience, and if you could talk to about like don't texting donors, and I know that a lot of nonprofits kind of worry that they're texting too little or too much. So maybe what is like the best practice with texting donors, especially year end, but just in general?
Yeah. So I'm a fan of texting. I will say it's not for everyone. Generally, if you've never sent a mass text before, and of course you want people to have opted in to messaging them and not just spamming people via text. But I usually say if I'm with a nonprofit and I see all this data, all these mobile numbers, never message, I say do a message. Find out, people are going to opt out, like through the Network for Good tool. People can easily opt out. People will opt out, but it's going to make an audience that's tighter, that are people that are willing and open to being engaged that way. The open rate on a text is way higher than an email. And so when I do it for end of the year, for example, or Giving Day, I might send, one in November, and I always do one like December 31st. It's kind of whenever you want to stress urgency or whenever you're close to a goal, I find are perfect times to do it. And most donors are like, okay, I get it. They're 99% to their goal. They're using everything available to them to remind people. I haven't given yet. Let me make a quick gift. For Giving Days, sometimes I've been with nonprofits that do it 2 or 3 times. But again, you want to try, like if someone just gave, you want to try to be able to segment out the people that are participating. So you're not really bombarding the ones, that have given, with multiple texts throughout the day for Giving Day. But I find texting to be very useful. I often too, like when I go into the year-end campaign, sometimes I'll go ahead, make my short list of top prospects for retention reasons or new. And I'm putting in that sheet of paper, I'm looking at their email, their mobile number, and their LinkedIn. I have all 3 at the ready. And I'm not going to end that calendar year without having gotten a yes, a no from every single one of them. And so texting is one option there, where I might start with the email as the foundation, right? They're used to what we're doing. They're part of the mass campaign we're doing. But I might then, even on my personal cell or work cell, I might go ahead and queue up little text messages to them. And also say, hey, hope you got my email. I just thought I'd reach out via text as well. Really would love for you all to join us. Happy to have a quick call with you about what we're doing. But texting is very valuable.
Yeah, and I'll add some additional context there, Lucas. And this is one thing that makes Bonterra's fundraising and engagement solution in terms of automation, right? We can blend together online and offline, including email, text, personal outreach, all into one automation, which is really helpful for a lot of our customers. But to give some additional context to what Lucas was talking about, open rate, the last I saw, it was 90+% of texts are open within the first 3 minutes of being received. So in terms of a channel and open rate, it is what email probably was back in the 90s. And what we've found, and what I find my customers are most worried about, and Lucas touched on this a little bit, is we don't want to push anyone away. We don't want to offend anyone. Well, I can say from experience, politicians, retail businesses, people are used to getting text from organizations that they support now or they buy from. So if the fear is that engaging in SMS is going to push away a new donor, I would say push that to the back of your mind. Consumers today, donors today are using their phone so often, and they're getting these texts from not just friends and family anymore, that to Lucas's point, if it's not a channel that they don't want to engage on, they'll opt out, and that's okay. It doesn't mean they're leaving the organization forever, but you will get that tighter knit group that does want to engage on those channels and get updates and form asks and things like that.
Very good point. I know we're all kind of used to in this day and age the text coming through where, yeah, maybe like 10 years ago that wasn't as commonplace, but definitely, I know I am. But
Well, I will say actually one important thing to realize this year too is it's election year.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of comms that your donors are going to be hit with in the next few weeks and into November, and probably even post, depending on the results and everything happening. So I will say when I'm thinking through comms for year end and I'm thinking through these channels, especially texting, a lot of political campaigns are using texting. So I am factoring that into maybe the rate at which I would be sending messages and perhaps the content. Also, these days, a lot of donors are seeing links via text as potential spam or potential, hacks. And so I think as you do text messaging, like I like to warm people up before we really launch some of the more fundraising. So you might do a little text here, even in October, as just if you've never done it, to really get people used to getting text from that number, so they don't all of a sudden get that text on Giving Tuesday, like, oh no, this charity's been hacked and we're getting spam message. I don't want to click this link. So just something to think about.
Definitely a good call out, Lucas, with election season, election year, lots of texts, lots of emails, communications flowing through. So it can be challenging to kind of make your voice heard with all that, but can be done, right? Awesome. I don't know if we have any other questions. I do see a couple of questions throughout Q&A that are definitely better suited for kind of a one-on-one conversation, which again, we will have one of our colleagues reach out to you after today's session to kind of set up some of those questions as they relate to just some more things that I think can better be addressed on a one-on-one conversation. But again, folks, thank you for your time here and engaging in the chat and in Q&A. It always makes a great session when we have lots of questions, comments, people sharing tips and tricks throughout. And yeah, thank you, Lucas and Garrett, for your time this afternoon. Such an insightful presentation and Q&A session. I'm sure folks have a lot of takeaways that they can take. Oh, and lots of thank yous in the chat. Love to see that. So thank you both for your time here. And folks, we hope to see you at our next session. Be on the lookout for that. We have, of course, some additional ones relating to Giving Tuesday coming up. So be on the lookout for that, as well as the recording of this session that we'll be sending out. But thank you. Thank you guys. Thank you guys so much. Awesome.
Thanks,
I hope
everyone.
everyone has a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you at our next session. Bye, everyone.